Hi, everybody. Welcome to our very first Library Discovery Hour. And thank you for joining us today. I'm Anna Chen. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Director of the Wilson Library at Carolina. And this is my fourth week on the job, so I am especially excited to be here to learn with you all. And we are excited to be launching this new series whose purpose is to give an up-close look at the university libraries and a chance to meet the librarians and archivists behind every story that we share. And today's program is the first of 4 discovery hours that are planned between now and May. And we are thrilled to have 140 people on the call today, so thank you for being one of them. And feel free to settle in for the next hour with your lunch if you're on the East Coast, or with your breakfast if it's morning where you are. But before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing impact of Hurricane Helene. Our thoughts are with those in our state and elsewhere who have lost loved ones and all of those who are dealing with really unthinkable devastation and loss. And if you are interested in UNC's disaster recovery and relief efforts, there is a link that we will put in the chat. We are kicking off our Library Discover Hour series today with a dive into one of the most enduring and defining stories about our university, the fabled walk or not of Hinton James to become Carolina's first student. And as we learn more about Hinton James, we will also hear about the university archives at Wilson Library and how archival collections like this can help us look into our past to understand our present and our future. And I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Nicholas Graham, who is our university archivist. He's also worked in Wilson Library for more than 20 years, including in the North Carolina collection and as the first program coordinator of the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center. Nick has an incredible knowledge of university history, and so I know you are in for a treat today. So please enjoy the presentation, and then we will open it up for questions afterwards. And in the meantime, please feel free to submit any questions that you might have for Nick in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can do that at any time during the presentation. So, okay, on to you, Nick.
Thanks very much. I could just hear Hark the Sound playing on the bell tower outside my window, so I'm feeling inspired, and I hope you all are too. I'm going to work on sharing my screen, make sure everything is working there, and then be happy to get into the conversation. All right. The story of Hinton James is one of the most enduring legends in Carolina history. It's a great story and probably one that nearly all alums or longtime faculty or staff members have heard in one form or another. It goes usually something like this. In 1795, a young man named Hinton James, no doubt inspired by a passion for learning, walked all the way from his home near Wilmington to Chapel Hill, where he became the very first student to enroll at UNC. Now, I've heard variations of this story over the years. Many of them emphasize the fact that James walked alone. I've heard some versions that said it was just him and his dog. This afternoon, I want us to spend a little time exploring this story as a way of understanding more about the process and the purpose of archival research. I'll walk you through all the steps I took to learn about Hinton James and the way his story has grown and become an important part of our shared history at Carolina. When I ask the question, did Hinton James really walk all the way to UNC? What I'm really asking is, how do we know what we know? As an archivist, my first approach is always to go back to the original documents. What does the archival record say about Hinton James and how he got to UNC? How did his story become so well known at Carolina? These are the questions that I was really diving into, and this afternoon I'm inviting you to explore with me. And one quick aside before we get started. The question of whether Hinton James walked to UNC or not may feel like a frivolous question, and in some ways it is, but this process is not. In Wilson Library, we teach what we call primary source literacy, and it's an important part of a college education. In an era when misinformation is easily and often maliciously spread, it's essential to be able to have the ability to question received information and come to your own conclusions, and I think there's no better way to do that than by going to the archives. So let's dive in. Here are the facts we're starting with. These are all well documented enough. The date of the opening, Hinton James' arrival, the fact that he came from what is now Pender County, that we won't question them here. And I should mention, however, that the colorful image of Hinton James trudging to campus that was published in the 1935 Yakety Yak shown here, we're not treating that as a credible source. So I wanted to start by doing just a cursory look at his family in order to gather some context. So I read in biographical sources that his father was named John James and that Hinton was the oldest of 5 children. Thanks to readily available digitized federal census records, I was able to find the James family in the 1790 federal census. Here's the entry for the John James household. The census record confirms 2 parents and 5 children. The last column in the household census for 1790 is titled Slaves. According to this, the James family enslaved 26 people. The fact that there were enslaved laborers at home would have been one of the factors that enabled Hinton James to leave home for college instead of having to stay to work on the family farm. Conversely, the need to stay home and work would have prevented nearly all potential students from poorer families from attending the university in those days. As to the question of whether he walked all the way or not, I think we can also infer from this that the James family was certainly wealthy enough to afford horses. Also, we cannot rule out the fact that Hinton James may have brought an enslaved servant with him to college. This was not uncommon in the early days of the university. Turning to the sources in Wilson Library, those first few decades of UNC history are somewhat easy to explore. The earliest available records of the university are very well cataloged, and many have been transcribed and published. There are several mentions of James in early records, particularly in the records of the college debating societies. The excerpt shown here is from the Dialectic Society records. Very clearly his name, though I don't think it's in his handwriting. I think this was probably recorded by the person taking minutes. James also appears several times in faculty citations for good scholarship. In one instance, he was cited for his essay on the plagues of a college life. He also wrote one on the pleasures of a college life. Sadly, these essays have not survived. I imagine we could learn quite a lot from them. We only have one first-hand account written by Hinton James himself, and it's a letter from 1838, 40 years after he graduated, written in response to another alumnus who was asking about Hinton James' recollections of his experiences in Chapel Hill. In the excerpt shown here, James talks about how his early papers have succumbed to mice and other causes. In an era before central heating and air, the climate of southeastern North Carolina would have been particularly inhospitable to archival storage. In the letter, James recollects former classmates and faculty members, but says nothing about how he got to Chapel Hill. This suggests that the method of his travel, whether on horseback or on foot, was either not memorable or not unusual enough to bear mentioning. So as far as original contemporary sources go, that's about it. I couldn't find any contemporary newspaper accounts of Hinton James's arrival. In his letter, though, the one shown here, he mentions that some of the next students to arrive after him, so I think it's safe to say that, we can confirm that he was the first student. But that's about all. Where then did the legend of his long walk come from? To figure it out, we have to turn our attention to secondary sources, the published speeches and articles and books about Carolina history. The earliest published work on the history of UNC, was done by Kemp Plummer Battle. At the 1880 University Day celebration, Battle continued a campus history series he had started the previous year. This, as far as I have been able to tell, is where the story of Hinton James was presented publicly for the first time. Even then, Battle made it sound like a mythic journey. Soon the first student came in, journeying all the way, hundreds of miles from the lower Cape Fear on horseback, doubtless, saddlebags between his legs. The fact that this first account has him traveling on horseback stands out, but pay attention also to the dramatic presentation. Battle published the first volume of his history of the university in 1907. It's an important work that helped establish much of what we know about UNC history. He writes, "It was not until the 12th of February that the first student arrived, all the way from the banks of the lower Cape Fear, the precursor of a long line of seekers of knowledge. His residence was Wilmington, his name Hinton James." So the story still has a very dramatic element to it, but the facts remain the same. And I will make one small correction here. People from Pender County will want me to be sure to mention that James's home was closer to the town of Burgaw in what is now Pender County than it is to Wilmington. Shortly after Battle's history was published, Hinton James began to emerge as a sort of campus legend, as we see in this Tar Heel article from 1908 about the dialectic and philanthropic societies, which are described as being as old as the university itself. Their usefulness dates back almost to the time when Hinton James first tramped from Wilmington to Chapel Hill. Now, let's compare this to Battle's account from 1912, where he says, Hinton James has gained immortal fame by being the first to trudge through the muddy roads in the winter of 1795, presenting himself to the delighted gaze of the first presiding professor. So let's take a moment here and think about this. We know now what's in the original documents, and because of that, we can begin to see where historians take small liberties in order to present a compelling story. The fact of the muddy roads is documented. The winter of 1795 was particularly unpleasant in North Carolina, but I doubt very much that Battle had direct evidence of a delighted gaze on the face of Professor David Kerr. Nonetheless, in my interpretation, this account by Battle and the one we just looked at from the Tar Heel is where the idea of Hinton James's long walk came from. Instead of just saying that he traveled along southeastern North Carolina, the colorful choice of words tramped and trudged were suggestive of James walking, even if that's not what the authors intended. That's exactly what a later Tar Heel student journalist inferred in 1920 by comparing an impressive performance by a Carolina baseball player to the time Hinton James established the Carolina long-distance walking record by tramping all the way from Wilmington so he could be the first student to enter the university in 1795. So there we've seen how the story has evolved from Hinton James arriving on horseback, doubtless, to setting the long-distance walking record. Once this story of Hinton James's long walk was out there, it stuck. In the second part of the talk, I want to focus on how this story took root and the ways it has become an important part of the shared campus mythology. As a first step, it was embraced by the university administration. In 1945, when UNC was celebrating its sesquicentennial, the story of Hinton James was held up as a significant milestone. This was the first time that I could find that the university celebrated Hinton James Day on February 12th. So while it's important for the university to acknowledge the importance of Hinton James's story, it became enshrined on the campus landscape in 1967 when one of the new high-rise dorms on South Campus was named in his honor. The dorm was and remains one of the southernmost on campus, meaning its residents appropriately, perhaps, have a long walk to Polk Place where many of their classes are held. The Daily Tar Heel noted this, writing that the dorm is located somewhere between Chapel Hill and Wilmington. Dorm names, too, are especially significant in that they become a sort of part of students' identities. They're constantly telling people what dorm they live in, or asking the same of others. So the dorm names become important in a way that an academic building namesake might not. And they might even wear them on t-shirts. This is a shirt from 1975 shared by an alumnus for the UNC t-shirt archive. So we see the Hinton James story embraced by the administration. It's on the campus landscape, and there's this one more group that is key in establishing this in our shared history. That's the Alumni Association. For many years in the early 2000s, the Alumni Association sponsored Hinton James Day. These ads for the events really play up the story of the walk. And I've seen several that use the pair of old boots as a symbol of his journey. In 2018, the Order of the Bell Tower, the student branch of the Alumni Association, even had a student dressed as Hinton James walking around campus. I remember this happening at least a couple of times. Here he is at the campus dining hall. It was only, okay, so dressing up as Hinton James is one thing, but if somebody really wanted to honor his story, what's an even better way of doing that? By walking. It was only a matter of time before somebody took this on, and the first one to do it, as far as I can tell, was Mark Henderson, class of 1951, who walked from Hinton James's gravesite in Pender County to Chapel Hill, arriving just in time for the university's bicentennial celebration in 1993. If it works, we've got video of Hinton's arrival announced by Woody Durham. Bear with me for a minute, and I'm going to see if we can get this video going.
Alumni of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The alumni processional is led by Mark Henderson, class of 1951, who has just completed Hinton James' historic walk from Wilmington in honor of the bicentennial. And Dr. William Richardson Davy of Southwestern Louisiana University, a direct descendant of the founding father of the university.
Mark Henderson, UNC class of 1951, with his backpack on, having made the historic walk, and now carries the banner of university alumni.
I saw him about 8 miles east of Chapel Hill at lunchtime today, so I think he had to move it to get here on time for tonight. He looks a little tired. He made it. He made it. Sure
And being here this evening and having the chance to walk in front of this crowd will certainly reinvigorate him and he waits the president's address. You know,
I think it's certain that however Hinton James got here, his arrival was not as dramatic as Mark Henderson's. I wanted to point out too that the bicentennial celebration, some of you probably remember it, but it's especially well documented in Wilson Library. And so shown here is a copy of Mark Henderson's itinerary that we can share out if anyone wants to take this on their own. He did it in, let's see, about 9 or 10 days. In 2008, a group of recent alums made the same trip on foot, and they bested Hinton James in at least one aspect by making the journey during a particularly hot North Carolina summer. I want to point out that much of this research was originally done for a blog post I wrote several years ago. The post is an example of the kinds of campus history work that we do all the time in Wilson Library. We do research guides, digital exhibits, physical exhibits in the library, blogs, and we have other resources devoted to UNC Chapel Hill history. This is an important part of the work that we do in the library, and it continues to be an effective way of engaging with the campus community from first-year students to administrators and alumni. Before we wrap up, there are just a couple of things I want to highlight. The first is simply to draw your attention to the wide variety of ways that we document the history of UNC Chapel Hill and Wilson Library. In the slides today, we saw 19th and 18th century documents, speeches, published books and articles, student newspapers, print and digital photographs, administrative office records, a video, and a t-shirt. The university is large, diverse, and complex, and so we must be responsive and creative in the ways we document its history. The second thing, going back to some of my comments at the start, is that this presentation is really a kind of case study. It's an example of the work that happens in Wilson Library every day from our many visitors who range from experienced scholars to genealogists to UNC undergraduates encountering primary sources for the first time. And it's also an example of how the stories and histories we receive are rarely as simple as they often seem at first. This requires curiosity, open-mindedness, and a willingness to accept that you may not end up with a clear and easy answer, which is the case in this study. These approaches are essential for doing historical research, but also, I would argue, even more important for informed citizenship in a democracy, encouraging us all to keep asking, how do we know what we know? Finally, I just want to share my spin on why I think the Hinton James story has stuck and why it continues to matter today. So even though he may not have walked every step of the way, and even though he came from a position of privilege to a university that was at the time off limits to the majority of many North Carolinians, I believe that this story matters because Hinton James unquestionably made a challenging journey and took a tremendous leap of faith to come to UNC. And his story should remain an inspiration for the generation of students, so many of whom over the past 229 years have followed difficult paths of their own to come to Chapel Hill. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was fantastic. And now we have time for questions. So please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we can pick them up from there. And in the meantime, we already have our first question, which is, how far did he walk?
Or did he walk? I think, it's impossible to answer that. And we do have a great collection of historic maps of North Carolina in Wilson Library, and many of those have been digitized. And so I think the best way to answer that would try to figure out, what paths or, quote unquote, roads were available in from southeastern North Carolina to Chapel Hill in the 1790s. It's a very good question. Google says it's 127 miles by foot. So
I think people are very interested in the logistics of
Yeah.
this trip, because question 2
Yep.
is, could we see a map of the possible routes for the time? I don't think Raleigh existed at the time, and remember seeing that post roads went via Fayetteville. Is this correct?
Partially, yeah, Raleigh had been established at the time. And, it certainly precedes the railroads. If you, maybe someone can share a link in the chat, but if not, if you just Google North Carolina maps, UNC, you'll get to a collection of historic maps that we've put online. I believe this predates plank roads too, but there may have been, trading paths or roads that probably followed the paths of Native American trading paths. But yeah, the digitized historic map site is fascinating. I worked on it a lot many years ago. So I encourage people. There's a link in the chat.
Excellent. Okay, and next question. How many students joined Hinton James in the first class at UNC?
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. So the first graduating class, a few years later in 1798, I think was fewer than 20.
All right. Next, okay, yeah, and all right, here's another, it feels like there's another theme emerging, which is about these early days and the nitty-gritty. What was the curriculum like when the university opened? Was it similar to the classical AB that was offered by other colleges at the time? How well prepared were the students, particularly in Latin and Greek?
I don't know how well prepared they were. It really depends on what kind of preparatory schools they went to. And I think one of the things that university instructors found early on is that students were not as well prepared as they had hoped. So they had to do some of that kind of rudimentary work early on. When you look at some of the what people are writing about, it's pretty wide ranging, but a lot of their study seemed to be focused on languages early on, especially classical languages.
And kind of following up on this, on your comments about kind of the college experience at this time. So UNC had opened and had a professor, but no students were taking classes until Hinton James arrived. Do you know if that was common practice with the opening of a school?
That's a great question, and I do not know how common that was. It was nearly a month. UNC opened on January 15th. They had a ceremony there, apparently in terrible weather, but it was nearly a month before the first student arrived. I don't know how other contemporary schools, like the University of Georgia, for example, that compares. I would think that would be unusual to open a school and then wait a month for the first student to arrive, but I'm not sure.
All right, well, all of these are going to turn into research questions for somebody. Yes. Next question is oh, sorry, hold on. My screen jumped away. Is Battle generally credible on the facts, or was he more interested in telling good stories, do you think?
This is a fantastic question, and I don't know. There's a lot that is in the first volume of Battle's history that I have a hard time finding documentation for in the university records. And so I don't think that means that he made things up. It either means that those documents, didn't survive. There's a chance that Battle may have taken things home with him when he was working on his history and they never came back. Original university records were in the attic of South Building for decades, and that was not great storage conditions. So I really don't know. Battle certainly told a lot of compelling stories, but I think there were probably compelling stories to tell. A lot of his book is pretty dry, so I don't, he didn't err too much on the side of telling colorful stories. But yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't know if we'll ever be able to fully answer in some aspects.
Thank you. Next question. Could you talk a bit more on the role of the role that enslaved people would have had and where they might have stayed with the first classes of students?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and there's been a lot of great research on this in recent years. So enslaved people would have been a very visible presence on the UNC campus really until emancipation in 1865. So for those first decades, like I said, some students brought enslaved servants with them to campus. We know that because there was a later act from the Board of Trustees banning the practice. So enslaved laborers on campus would have been active in constructing all of the original buildings. And then they also served as, what they called college servants. So they would have been on campus building fires in the students' rooms, helping to prepare meals, doing, landscaping and janitorial work, and continued work on the building. So again, very significant presence in many ways.
Thank you.
And where did they live? We don't know for sure. We don't have great either written or archaeological evidence of that. It appears they would have lived off campus. So the university did not directly enslave people, but what the university did was leased enslaved laborers from a lot of times faculty and administrators. So they would have lived, off campus, what we call off campus, but most likely in what's now some of the historic districts near UNC, Chapel Hill.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the question also. The next question, was Hinton James perhaps descended from those that settled in North Carolina in an area that Dr. Powell referred to as the Welsh Tract?
Great question. I don't know. I did not dive into James's family history. I know that, there's still Hinton James descendants, probably in North Carolina. One of the video didn't show this, but one of the people walking next to Mark Henderson, when he was coming in with his banner, was I believe, a direct descendant of Hinton James.
Great. So next question, pivoting a little bit, what are some of your favorite items in the UNC collections?
I kind of like some of the things that established. So if you come to Wilson Library now, there's a great exhibit in the Salter exhibit room called Curated. It's got highlights from all the different collections. And one of the ones that we got out for University Archives is the original handwritten minutes from the Board of Trustees from their first few years. And it's open to the page in 1792 where they select Chapel Hill as the site of the university campus. So I think that's a particularly significant one and kind of like fun to think about that, the university was established before they even knew where they were going to put it. I love the Daily Tar Heel. I always get sidetracked reading old issues. But I really enjoy some of the kind of ephemeral things that are here. Some of the old, flyers or posters that used to be on campus buildings, things that kind of provide a glimpse into student life.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm just going to insert my own question in here real quick. Can you say more about the T-shirt archive?
Yes, absolutely. This was something that we started several years ago, and there's a pretty good collection of UNC T-shirts in the North Carolina Collection Gallery, but we were interested in kind of capturing T-shirts as a way of, student self-expression. I mean, anyone who's on campus regularly or has been on campus regularly know that there's a huge variety of creative and often pretty funny UNC T-shirts. So we asked students and alums to contribute photos of their favorite UNC T-shirts. We had a few photo days where people came in and got their pictures taken. So that's available as a website now. They're great anti-Duke shirts. They're just shirts from different UNC programs. I love that Hinton James one. And we're very much open for new contributions. If you have a favorite that you don't see on there, send us a note. We'll get it into the T-shirt archive.
Nice plug. Thank you. Next question. How did you get into archival work, university archival work?
Sure. It was through, I came to graduate school at UNC, the School of Information and Library Science, with an interest in working in academic libraries, but not knowing much more than that. And it was really through working in Wilson Library So as a grad student here, I worked in the North Carolina collection and the Southern Historical Collection, and was very much taken with this kind of work. I've had different jobs in Wilson Library over the past several years. But when the University Archivist job was open, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I was really excited to apply for it, and more excited to be in this job. I think it's, we talk about all the great strengths of Wilson Library. One of the things that especially attracts me to university archives, and this is true for every university, is that it's unique. We are the only institution in the world that is documenting this university, and the collections are fantastic. And so it's a great, similar to what we did here today, it's a great way to dive into archival research. And, I think the history of the university mirrors the history of the country in a microcosm in many ways. And so I think it's a great, I enjoy it, but I think it's a great opportunity for students to get into primary source research.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in kind of this career path and what it entails. Here's another question about that. How long have you been the university archivist? And if the archives were an iceberg, how big would it be? And what percentage of it would you estimate that you personally have interacted with or used?
Those are great questions. The first, I think, 8 years now, around 7 or 8 years that I've been in University Archives, they were an iceberg. I don't know. I imagine they would easily fill maybe one of the floors in Wilson Library. I don't believe it's the biggest collection here. And how much have I interacted with? Just a fraction of it. Some of the early materials are kind of easy to get a grasp on, but as we get into the 20th century, and a larger university bureaucracy, and then as we get into the digital era, just lots more documentation. So as the university grows, so too does the university archive.
Your kind of comment about documentation kind of leads into this next question. Are there any other frequently told myths about the university that don't have a lot of information to back them up?
Yes, and we should do one of the ones that comes up a lot is students are adamant about this, that Phillips Hall which is home of the university's physics, I think the math department now too, that the university received the wrong plans for it, that it was supposed to be sent to another university, but it was actually accidentally sent to UNC. And so people tell that story that it was intended for someplace else, which is demonstrably untrue. Another one that the campus tour guides that many of you have probably heard, is the dunce cap story, that the bell tower intentionally placed directly behind Wilson Library so that it would look like a dunce cap on top of Louis Round Wilson's dime round head. And that one persists, but there's kind of a clear record of the efforts to place the bell tower.
That's interesting. Yeah, those would make fun discovery hours too. Another question about documentation. Are the documents shown in the talk accessible?
Yeah, all of them are. Wilson Library, all of the collections here are open. Our reading room operates by appointment only, but all you have to do is you can send an email, you can request the catalog, and set up a time to come in and take a look at these yourself. You're absolutely all invited to do that.
Excellent. Yes. Going back to Hinton James specifically, how old was he when he arrived at UNC?
I don't know when his birthday. He was born in 1776. So a lot of people have played up that, that was obviously the year of the Declaration of Independence, also the year of North Carolina's first constitution, which called for an institution of higher learning. So Hinton James, in that way, is also symbolic of the university coming of age. So he would have been 18 or 19.
And what do we know about James after he graduated?
He did live in Wilmington, not Pender County, and he had a career there in business. He worked as a surveyor and engineer. So many people have pointed out that if he were coming to college now, he probably would have gone to NC State to get those interests. I believe he was the mayor of Wilmington at one time. And so, yeah, he had kind of a varied but successful career in that part of the state.
That's great. And then there's also a second part to this question. You mentioned descendants, but did he return to Burgon? Did he keep enslaved persons?
He did. And we know, we know that from census records. We also know that because there are published newspaper runaway slave ads published by Hinton James. So not only, did he, enslave people, but there's a record of them actively trying to escape. So yeah, absolutely. And that is probably would have been true for many of the earliest UNC alums, and certainly was true for nearly all of the early Board of Trustees members.
Mm-hmm. And is those ads that you mentioned, are they part of the university archives?
They're in newspapers. So the newspapers that are available in Wilson Library and online on Digital NC.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. At the time that Battle wrote, American universities were undergoing significant changes in both curricula and student life. Do the themes in Battle's writing reflect those changes?
Good question. I can't answer that as much. A lot of his writing is just, as it gets later, it's just going year by year. Here are the people who graduated, here are the significant things. So I don't know how much he took on that broader, the broader questions. I mean, I assume you're talking about this was a time, early 20th century when graduate education was becoming an important part of the, kind of this idea of a modern research university was evolving. I don't know to what extent Battle got into that. I don't believe very much.
Are there opportunities for alumni to help with transcription or indexing of records in the university archives?
Yes, we've been doing a good bit of this, and I think some of this work started during the pandemic quarantine, but it has continued. We're working with a company called From the Page, which enables what we call crowdsource, but open transcription of documents. And I think we can share a link in the chat to the university materials available there.
Great. Next question. So after hearing of the destruction of libraries and archives in hurricanes and other severe storms over the years, I hope and pray the archive there has a plan in place to protect these incredible and irreplaceable treasures. So actually, I guess this is not so much a question, but I certainly invite you to comment on how we think about the consequences of these kinds of disasters and our place.
I mean, Anna, you could answer this question as well as me. Just to say that we do think about it, and we do think about disaster planning. We think about worst case scenarios, and we think about protecting the collections. Geographically, we're in an area that has been okay so far. The Wilson Library building has had challenges, but has been secure from the elements pretty much so far. But yeah, this is something that we think about and plan for.
Yes, and there are definitely librarians here who have kind of significant part of their job responsibilities is to think about this question. And it occurs to me that would also make a great discovery hour.
It would.
So we'll make a note of that. So we can talk more about that if people are interested. Another question, are the materials used in this talk available online?
Not all of them, not yet, but most of them are. And they're available. We generally present things online, we do digital exhibits, but generally we present things by collection. So, the slides I'll noted what collections I took things from for the presentation.
It's great that there is interest in having documentation of this talk itself. That's great. Okay, next question. There's been an effort in recent years to rename buildings on campus that are named for proponents of slavery. Can you speak to the role of the archives in this effort? Is Hinton James dorm under consideration for renaming?
Sure. So a lot of this work has been led by the Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. And they did a significant amount of research in Wilson Library. And so we worked with the faculty and grad students who are helping to prepare a lot of that information. They wrote summaries, what they call dossiers on namesakes that they were proposing for removal. A couple of buildings were renamed. I think, I hope you all saw at least news coverage of the ceremonies renaming buildings in honor of Hortense McClinton and Henry Owl. There are a number of proposals to rename different buildings that were currently sent to the Board of Trustees. Hinton James dorm was not on that list. And my understanding, and this is me not speaking for the commission, but my understanding was they were really looking at namesakes that were, not just not just the fact that they enslaved people, but they were, either through their involvements in politics or other methods, significantly involved in shaping the policies of their time. And so, again, Hinton James is not on that list as far as I'm aware.
Thank you. Okay, next question. When do you expect to publish a new edition of UNC A to Z?
Thank you. Great question. April. The revised edition of UNC Press is coming out sometime this spring. I don't know an exact date yet, but in time to make it a good graduation gift. We'll have Cecilia Moore and I have been working on that for a while. We'll have some new entries, some updates, a few new photos. So thanks for asking.
Yeah. So we have time for one more question. So I am going to ask it. What do you find most rewarding about your work?
Opportunities like this. I think this is true for all of us who work in Wilson Library. Some of the most exciting and most interesting things that we find, happen when we're looking for something else, and we, have opportunities to share them with each other. But it's always rewarding to be able to share with students or to share with all of you who are voluntarily spending your lunch hours with us. And I especially enjoy sharing with UNC students and alums whose passion for the university is always clear.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you, Nick, as well for taking the time to share your knowledge. And thank you all in the audience for joining us today. And I want to give a special thanks to our friends of the library. We are incredibly grateful for your continued support of the libraries here at Carolina. There is so much to discover about the university libraries. I think the questions that came through in this session, we should save them all because they are portals to all kinds of avenues of research that we only could scratch the surface of today. And it's wonderful to see how the libraries enhance the students, the experience of students and faculty and friends like you. So please mark your calendar for our next Library Discovery Hour on December 13th, where you will get to know many of our newest librarians who have joined Carolina and hear about their unique views of campus life today. And we have shared the link to that in the chat. So thanks so much again, and hope to see you there.